We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Daladam and Beis Meseches Gitin. This is Gittin Daf 44b. On the previous Talmud, the Gemara asked if a person sells his Eved to an Oved Kochavim and then he dies. So generally there's a knas that the person now has to redeem that Eved from the Oved Kochavim. Does that knas apply to the son? And the Gemara continues its question, V'imtim Salomar, and if you will say, Kivin Malachto B'moed, if a person purposely makes it that he's going to end up doing work on Chol HaMoed, V'meis, and then he dies, Lo Kansu B'no Acharav, so there we say that we don't find his son after him. Mishum de Lo Avad Isur, that's because over there, in that case, he didn't actually do an Isser, but Hachamai, but over here again, what's the halacha by the Eved? L'didei Kansu Rabbanan V'halese, is the knas against him, and he's no longer around, he died. O Dilma L'mamone Kansu Rabbanan, or maybe the knas is against his money, V'isa, his money is still around, his property is still around, essentially the knas would apply to his son. And Rashi explains, Vimtim Solomar, and if you will say, Gave Mechavin Melachto B'moed, by somebody that purposely sets it up that he'll be able to do work on Chol HaMoed, Sheyachol Lasos Kodem HaMoed. In other words, he could have done all this work before the holiday. He didn't have to do it on Chol HaMoed. Ola Nichemil Haschel Ba'ad La'achar HaMoed, or he could have waited and not even began the work until after the holiday. But he didn't do that. He set it up as follows. V'kevan Ditzimtzem Lahaschel Ba Samach LaMoed. What he did was he began the work before the Moed. Shim Lo Yigmarena B'moed Yedavar Avid. And then he set up a situation where if he doesn't finish this work on Chol HaMoed, there's going to be a loss of money. And in general, by a loss of money, you could do work on Chol HaMoed, but he purposely set up a situation where it creates that there is a loss of money to try to get it permitted. Via mutter lagomer, that way it'll be mutter for him to finish the work. Utanan Hasam, we learned in the Mishnah over there in Moed Katan, V'kulan Mechivnu Malachtam V'moed Yovedu. In all cases, if you do this, so you end up losing out. We don't allow you to do this work. It's better that you should lose the money. You can't purposely set up a situation of davar of it. And so the question over there was, what if he purposely sets it up, but then he dies? So now it's going to be a loss to the son. We have a question over there, does the knas apply to his son? And so now our Gemara is saying, if you're going to say over there, that the knas does apply in that situation, even though there was no isser that was committed in that case, meaning he died before he ever committed any isser, because he was not around on Chol HaMoed to do the malacha. So kol shekein ha davar isur. So then if you're going to say that over there the knas applies, it certainly would apply to the son over here by the Eved. However, avolim tim salomar, but if you will say, and this is what our Gemara is now saying, if you're going to say bahida lo kansua, that in the case of Chol HaMoed they did not find the son, akati hami boilan, we would still have a question over here. To asamu de lo avad avua isur, because there was no isur that the father actually committed yet. Sharei meis kodem hamoed, because he died before Chol HaMoed. V'lo ba lidei isur, never came to a situation of isur, and so that's why over here maybe it's different, because an isur was committed, and therefore the fine might still apply. And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei said to him, Tanisua, we have the answer to this question of whether we find the son. It's in the following Mishnah. Sada sheniskavtza b'shvius. If you have a sada, you have a field during the Shemitah year and you remove the thorns of the field, Tizra l'matzoi shvius. It's still able to be planted on matzoi shvius, after shvius. As Rashi says, sheniskavtza nitzlu mimenu kotzim, you took out the thorns of arkonim liafosa to make it nicer. V'ein zu avodas karka min haTorah. This is not really considered working the land on a doraisa level, so lo kansu. So there's no fine in this case for Tizra l'matzoi shvius. You can plant there l'matzoi shvius after the Shemitah year. But the Gemara continues, Netaiva or Nedaira, but let's say he fertilizes the field, or he puts all the animals in there in order that the animals will fertilize the field. Lo tizra l'matzoi shvius. So in that case already, there is a knas, he's not allowed to plant it l'matzoi shvius after the Shemitah year. Rashi says, Netaiva is davla v'holich lo zevel ba'agolos u'masos. Netaiva means you actually take the manure there in order to fertilize the field, and Nedaira means al yedei dir behemel zavli. You lock a bunch of animals in there, you pen a bunch of animals in there, and then they fertilize the field. Avodas karka hivakonsonoso. That is considered avodas karka, and there is a fine in that case. Again, by Netaiva or Nedaira, there is a fine. V'yomer Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said, Naktinon, we hold as follows. Heitiva v'meis, let's say he fertilized the field and then he died, b'no zora. So in that case, the son is allowed to plant the field. Almo l'didei kansur rabbanan, livrei lo kansur rabbanan. You see that the fine applies to him and it does not apply to his son, and the same thing would be true in our case by the Eved. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya, Abaya says, Naktinon, we hold, Timei taharo shel chavero v'meis. If a person is mitame the produce of his friend that is pure, and then he dies, lo kansu rabbanan b'no acharav. They don't find, the rabbanan don't find his son after him. My time, what's the reason? Hezek she'eno nikor lo shmei hezek, because this is a damage that's not visible. That's not really called damage. Uknasu de rabbani. The only reason that we obligate the person to pay is just a fine from the rabbanan. L'didei kansu rabbanan livrei lo kakansu rabbanan. So to him we fine, but we're not going to fine his son. Rashi says, Lo kansu b'no acharav l'shalim, he doesn't have to pay. V'yafal gav shu chayv l'shalim, even though the father would have to pay. K'nitanan b'hani zokin, like it says later on, ha'metame v'hamedave menasech shogeg pater, u'mezet chayiv, it says he's chayiv. But sheino nikar, but if it's a damage that's not visible, hatuma ina nikeres b'peres, you can't see the impurity in the fruits, so lo shmei hezek, that's not called damage. L'chayiv nechosim min haTorah, he's not chayiv on a doraisa level, it's just a knas, and the knas does not apply to the son. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Ola chutz la'aretz. If he said, it said in the Mishnah rather that if he sold his eved to chutz la'aretz, so in such a situation the eved goes free. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hamocher avdo l'chutz la'aretz. If somebody sells his eved to chutz la'aretz, yotzal l'cheirus v'tzorach yet shichror me'rabo sheni. He goes free, and he requires a document to set him free from his second master. Rashi says, L'chutz la'aretz afilu liYisrael. We're talking about he sells him to chutz la'aretz, even to a Jew. So again, it says over here, he requires to get shichror, and who has to free him? The second master has to free him. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Lomer, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Pa'amim yotza, u'pa'amim lo yotza. Sometimes he goes out, and sometimes he does not go out. Keitzad, how so? Amar ploni avdi mechartiu leploni antuchi lo yotza. If he says that I'm selling so-and-so my eved to so-and-so who is an antuchi, he does not go free in that case. But la antuchi sheba antuchia, but if he says I'm selling him to the antuchi who lives in antuchia, meaning he makes it clear that he's selling him to chutz la'aretz, so then yotza, so then he does go out, then he does go free. Rashi explains, Leploni antuchi, mashma shenolad ba'antuchia. When you say antuchia, it means the person comes from there. He was born in Antuchia. V'lo mashma shenolad v'dor ba'antuchia. He's not saying that I'm selling it to so-and-so who lives in Antuchia. He's just saying so-and-so who comes from Antuchia. You could say that the person never purchased him in order to take him to chutz la'aretz. Therefore, he doesn't go free in that case. Even if the person takes him to chutz la'aretz, you can always say that his intention is to return. But if he says sheba antochia, I'm selling it to so and so in Antuchia, mashma shadiraso sham, that already sounds like he lives there. And he bought him for the purpose of taking him to chutz la'aretz. That's already a problem. That is the distinction that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is making. Again, lantuchi sheba antochia. In that case, he goes free. And the Gemara continues, Vatanya, but we learned in a brisa. Mechartiu la'antuchi yotz. It says again, if he says I'm selling him to antuchi, he goes free. La'antuchi hasharoi belud. But if you say antuchi who lives in Lud, now Lud is part of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, if you specify that he's living in Lud, lo yotza, that's when he does not go free. So that sounds like from this brisa, if you specify that the eved is going to be staying in Eretz Yisrael, that's the only time he doesn't go free. But otherwise, even if he just says I'm selling him la'antuchi, that is enough to say that he goes free. And the Gemara answers to that, Lo kasha, it's not difficult. Had de islay beisa b'Eretz Yisrael, had de islay ushpiza b'Eretz Yisrael. In one case, we're talking about where he has a house in Eretz Yisrael. In the other case, we're talking about where he's just temporarily, he has a host that he's staying by in Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi explains, Hada katani leploni antuchi lo yatsa, when it says that if I'm selling to ploni antuchi, he doesn't go free. Adamar shabantuchi, unless you specify that he's actually going to the place of antuchia. The islay l'hai antuchi bayis be'Eretz Yisrael. That's when this antuchi, he has a house in Eretz Yisrael. So if he has a house in Eretz Yisrael, you can assume that the eved will be in Eretz Yisrael. But in the case where it says that he goes free when he sells it to the antuchi, unless you specify otherwise, but you assume that he's going to be living outside of Eretz Yisrael automatically, again, unless you specify Lud, you specify that he'll be in Eretz Yisrael, that's the leslay bias. That's when he doesn't have a house in Eretz Yisrael. Aval ushpiza islay. All he has is a host. He's staying temporarily in Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah asks the following question, Ben Bavel shenasa isha be'Eretz Yisrael. If you have a person from Bavel and he marries a woman in Eretz Yisrael, v'echnisa lo avad mushvachas, and she brings into the marriage part of her dowry, she brings in slaves and maidservants, v'daito lachzer, and his intention is to return to Bavel, so essentially she's almost like selling him the slaves to chutz la'aretz. So what's the halacha in that case? Is it considered like she sold the slaves to chutz la'aretz, and therefore the slaves would go free? And the Gemara clarifies, Tiboy leman damar hadin ima. This is a question whether you hold like the one who says that she is the one, the law is on her side. We'll see Rashi in a moment. And Tiboy leman damar hadin ima. It's also a question according to the one who says that the law is on his side. And Rashi explains, Mahu mihavi hachitasa kemocheres eved zel chutzlaretz. In this case, is it as if the wife sold the eved off to chutzlaretz b'nisun halal by getting married? Tekaimelon bal b'nichse ishto lo ke'echav, because we have established that a husband, when he takes this property from his wife, he's like a purchaser. V'yatzu l'cheirus, so then they would go free. Oh, or maybe we don't say that. And the Gemara clarified, let's say you have a situation where, again, she brings in this dowry for her husband, and then he divorces her. So he omeres klianino teles. So she says, I want back the actual dowry. I want back the actual vessel. V'hu omer, and then he says back, no, damim ani nosein. Kemosha shamum li b'achra yusi b'nechzeitzon barzel. There's a set value when the marriage began. They decide what is the value of all these items she's bringing in. That's called nechzeitzon barzel. He owes her that exact value. She now says, I want the actual object back. And he says, I don't want to give you the object, but I'll give you the exact value, hanishomen b'ksuba, the exact value or their valuation that we set up in the ksuba. So there's a question over there whether she wins that case or he wins that case. There's a mandomer that says he's the one that wins the case because they're in his achrayus. He's taking responsibility. If those items get lost, he certainly owes her the money for those items, and so therefore he's able to say, I'm going to give you the money. And there's another mandomer that says, no, she's the one that wins that case, mishum shavach beisavia, because this is considered shavach beisavia, is from the house of her father, and she's able to ask for the actual items. And the Gemara continues, it's a question according to the one who says that the law is on her side. Since the law is on her side, it's really still like hers. It's not as if she actually sold it to him. Odilma, or maybe, since that property belongs to him in terms of the fruits of that property, it is like his, and therefore we would say it is like she's selling it to him and selling it to Chutz Laretz. And you can also ask according to the one who says that the law is on his side. Since the law is on his side, he can keep the property and then give her money, so it's as if she sold it to him. Or maybe since he doesn't actually own the actual property, it's really like hers. And the Gemara says, the Gemara leaves this as a question. And Rashi explains, Lapira, again, the husband uses the avodim for the fruits of their labor, Shu Meshabed Bahen Lamalachto, he enslaves them in order to do his work, Delo Kanu Le Gufe, or we say, no, maybe he doesn't have the actual guf, the actual bodies, meaning the imayis or megarish lo hadrila, if he dies or if he divorces her, in general they go back to her, so even according to that Mando Amar, again, maybe it's considered to be like hers, and again, the Gemara leaves that as a question. And the Gemara continues at the Tudat. Some Rabbi Avo says, Shana li Rabbi Yochanan taught me as follows, Eved sheyotza acharabo l'Syria. If an Eved goes after his master to Syria, umachru sham rabo yotza l'cheiros, and his master sells him over there, he goes free in that case. Rashi says, L'Surya aram sova k'chutz laretzi. This area is considered like chutz laretz, l'mechiras avodim, in terms of the laws of selling slaves. Kedetanya b'perakama, like we learned in the first parak, hamocher avdo l'Surya, kemocher l'chutz laretz. If a person sells his eved to Surya, that's the equivalent of selling him to chutz laretz. Yotza l'cheiros, he goes free. V'yavapi sheyotza mitchila l'das. The point over here is, even though the eved really followed him to Surya, and he did that knowingly, the eved didn't have to go to Surya. V'yavim mochi eved lo avarabo matzah chayifle. The halacha is that if the eved would have protested, so the master can't force him to go to Surya. Kedetanan hakol malan l'Eretz Yisrael ve'en hakol motziin b'shnei dayani gezeros. As we learned in the Mishnah, everybody you can force them to come to Eretz Yisrael, but you can't force them to leave Eretz Yisrael. And so over here, in this case, he willingly followed his master to Surya, and then his master sold him over there. Still, he goes free. But the Gemara continues, Vatani Rabbi Chia, but didn't Rabbi Chia teach that he loses out in this situation? He loses out in terms of the benefit that he had. And the Gemara says to that, Lokash, it's not difficult. Kansha das rabo lachzor, kansha ein das rabo lachzor. In one case, we're talking about where the master intended on returning to Eretz Yisrael, and in the other case, we're talking about a situation where the master did not intend to return to Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi explains, Kan Shadas Rabo Lachzer. In one case, we're talking where the master intended on returning to Eretz Yisrael. Keshiyotz al manas ken yotza, meaning when the master left, the understanding was he was leaving and he was going to come back. V'kevan demachra, and then if the master goes ahead and sells him, havekimocher marz l'chutzlarz, then it's like he's selling him from Eretz Yisrael to chutzlarz, and in that case the slave would go free. But again, if the master never intended on returning to Eretz Yisrael, and the slave is the one that willingly followed the master outside of Eretz Yisrael, so then the slave loses out on that benefit. He doesn't go free when he's sold to chutzlarz. And the Gemara continues, Vatanya, and we have a brisa that supports this. Yotzei ha'eved acharabu l'Surya. It says the Eved, he follows his master to Surya. And the Gemara asks, Yotzei lo sagid lo nafik. What do you mean? He has to follow his master to Surya. That goes against what we just quoted in Rashi, and that's what the Gemara now brings. Vatanan. Then we learn in the Mishnah, Ve'en hakol motzi. And again, what Rashi brought before, you can't force someone to leave Eretz Yisrael. So rather, what must the brisa mean? Ela yotzei ha'eved acharabu l'Surya means if he did leave, not that he has to leave. If he did follow his master to Surya, umachro rabo sham, and then his master sold him over there, imdas rabo lachzor. So if it was a situation where the master was intending on returning to Eretz Yisrael, so then kofanos, then we force him to set the Eved free, because the Eved was really never leaving Eretz Yisrael, and now he's being sold to outside of Eretz Yisrael, he goes free. V'yemeindas rabo lachzor, but if it wasn't the intention of the master to return, so now the Eved essentially willingly left Eretz Yisrael, ein kofanos, so then we don't force the master to free the Eved. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravanan said, Shamis minei demar Shmuel tarti. I heard two things from Shmuel. Chodahach, one involved this case where a master sells his slave to chutzlaretz, and the slave goes free. V'idach dietmar, and the other one was the following machlokes amoraim. Hamocher sadeu b'shnas hayovel atzmo. Let's say somebody sells his field during the Yovel year itself. Rav Amar mechura v'yotze. Rav says the sale goes through, and then immediately the sale is reversed, because in the Yovel year, all the fields go back to their original owner. Ushmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Eina mechura kolikar. The sale doesn't take effect at all. And so now Rav Anon says, I heard in both of these cases, B'chada hadri zvina, I heard that in one of these cases, the money that was paid is returned, U'v'chada lo hadri zvina, and in the other one, the money is not returned. Meaning the money that the purchaser gave, that buyer doesn't get the money back. V'lo yada'na haiminaya, but I don't know which case was which. And so the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef says, Nichzi anon, let us see. Midatani bebraisa, from the fact that it says in the Braisa, Hamocher avdo l'chutzlarts, when one sells his evet to chutzlarts, yotzel l'cheres, he goes free. V'tzarech get shichror mei rabo sheni, and the second master needs to give him a document to set him free. So Shema Mina Kan Yerabo Sheni. We see from there that the second master does acquire the Eved. He is the current master of the Eved, and he's the one that has to set the Eved free. Velo Hadri Zvini. So we see from that he does acquire the Eved, and therefore he doesn't get his money back. That second master who purchased the Eved in Chutz Laretz, he doesn't get his money back. And so therefore we know in the case of the Eved, he's not getting his money back. Shmuel Hasam Eina Mechura. And so therefore in the case of the field, when the field is sold during the Yovel year, so in that case, Umos and in that case, the purchaser would get his money back, the idea being that it's not a sale at all. And Rashi explains, V'lo yada haiminayo, again he said, I don't know in which case the buyer gets his money back, in which case he doesn't get his money back. And Rashi notes, V'im Tomer, if you're going to ask, Shmuel b'mocher sadeo lo hadri zvini. If Shmuel held that in the case where the field was sold, and again Shmuel said it's not a sale at all, but in that case the buyer doesn't get his money back, the ibed ma'osav, and he loses his money, so b'mai polagoled Rav, then in that case, what's the argument with Rav? That seems to be what Rav is saying. To hol Rav nami lo hadra, because according to Rav, that was the whole point. Rav says that the sale goes through in the Yovel year, and then immediately we say that the original seller gets his field back. To kamar mechura v'yotza, we say that the sale goes through, and then the field goes back to the original owner, and there Rav is certainly saying that the buyer loses out on his money. So therefore you're going to say, if the buyer loses his money according to Rav, and we know that Shmuel argues with Rav, so how could Shmuel also say that he loses his money? Why is he saying, I don't know what Shmuel says? So Rashi explains, no, it could be that Shmuel says the same thing as Rav in terms of the fact that the buyer doesn't get his money back, but vadai pligi, but they would still be arguing. De'ilu l'Rav ha-mecher mecher, because according to Rav, the sale is an actual sale. Now, if you buy property, it's possible to acquire together with the land, you can acquire movable property. And that kinyan would work even if you don't actually pull, even if you don't make a kinyan on the movable property, you can acquire it along with the land, because there was in fact a kinyan on the land, according to Rav. It's just that the land immediately goes back to the original owner. Now, according to Shmuel, it's not a sale at all when the land is sold during the Yovel year. So the buyer gives the seller the money, and the sale doesn't go through at all. So why isn't the buyer getting the money back, or why is that even possible? Because you could say that the money is just a gift. In other words, we know the sale is nothing, and the fact that they're going through with the sale, it's as if the buyer is gifting the money to the seller. seller. But it wouldn't be a sale, and therefore there could be no acquisition of movable objects together with the kinyan made on the land, because there is no kinyan on the land. There would be no kinyan on these movable objects. You could retract in terms of the movable objects. Any money that was given for the movable objects, that would actually go back, but when it comes to the money that was given for the land, that's considered a gift to the seller. A person knows that you can't sell a field in the Yovel year. Therefore, we understand, or we assume, that the money is given as a gift, and that's why it is possible that Shmuel says the money doesn't go back to the buyer in the case of the field, but the Gemara ends up answering that's not the case anyway. Because by the slave we say that the second master is the one who frees the Eved. That shows that the second master does acquire the Eved, and then he loses out on his money because he's going to have to free the Eved. Because if you're going to say that everything goes back and it's the first master that actually is the owner, why would the second master be the one freeing him? We should be forcing the first master to free him, because he's the one that performed the Isser, he's the one that sold the Eved to Chutz La'aretz. So you see clearly that the sale actually goes through, the money stays with the seller, the Eved is with the buyer, and the buyer has to free the Eved. Now, since we know that Shmuel did say that in one of these cases the money does go back to the buyer, so it has to be that by the field the money goes back to the buyer, and the buyer is not going to lose out. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Memhei Amud Aleph.